Okay, so we're just going to start with some black. I'm using Vallejo Model Air Black, but you can use whichever black you want. The point is here, I know I'll be touching up the black later, so I want a consistent surface. I want a known quantity, so I just want the whole thing to start with the black I know I can use later and not the primer. And so now it's our first proper highlight, which we can use Vallejo Model Color Dark Sea Blue for. So we're just going to get that down to a layer consistency, and we're just going to quickly mark in where we want our highlights to be. I'm going for a main highlight at the front of the blade and a couple of smaller highlights towards the back of the blade. So now we're going to increase the value of our highlights by mixing in some scale 75 graphite. You can use any grey for this. And we're just going to use that now to start refining the highlights. So just using the tip of the brush here, we're going to really define the edge of the cutting surface. This is going to have a nice strong edge highlight. So we just need to be careful and just use the tip of the brush and just get a nice line in there. And then for the main highlights, we are just going to use little vertical strokes using the very tip of the brush, and this will help give us a sort of metallic texture. If you can imagine the blade has been dragged across the surface to sharpen it, so the grain of the metal is going down in vertical lines. So we're just going to use this throughout our highlighting to help add some texture to this non-metallic metal. We're just going to keep pushing the value on our highlights now, so now we're just going to use the scale 75 graphite on its own, and it's just more of the same, just in a smaller area. So nice little vertical stripes. Those will again reinforce that texture feel, and as they start covering a smaller and smaller area, this will give us the feeling of the shine when it contrasts the darker areas. So we just keep going, working on those highlights and working on the edges. With non-metallic metal, you always need strong edge highlights as well as your normal reflection highlights. So to increase the value now, we're going to use some Vallejo Model Color Ice Yellow. This is just a very pale yellow and will help to add a little bit of interest to those highlights. So we're just, again, using the very tip of the brush and just working around the highlighted areas and around the edges. Just making sure we're picking out that edge of the cutting blade and making sure it's got a nice strong highlight. So we're going to now use a glaze of the sort of mid-tone of these highlights, the mix of Vallejo Model Color Dark Sea Blue and Scale 75 Graphite, and we're just going to glaze this over from the dark areas into the highlights and use this to smooth out the highlights a little bit. We don't want them too smooth. We do want to feel the texture of the blade from the lines we've been using, but we just want to smooth it out a little bit. With that glaze, we're now going to add more highlights in, as they have now dulled down the highlights. But this is what we wanted. It's this back and forth that gets you the smooth results. So we're just going to take the model color ice yellow, and we're just going to go around reinforcing these highlights and just adding in more of these little highlight lines. So we're going to push it now to white, and again it's just more of the same but just smaller. So just take our time, work our way around, just using the very tip of the brush, and as we get a few layers down, a few of these little strokes, I'll start building up in our eye, and it'll start getting very high value, and that's when we'll start to get the feeling of shine. So I'm just picking out this top surface here on the top of the cutting area of the blade, as this is a flat surface facing directly towards the sky, so that's going to get the most light. And I'm just adding in another glaze of the mid-tone, and you just get a feel for this. If you want it smoother, you need to add more glazes. If you want it a slightly rougher feel, then you don't need to add as many glazes. And then whenever you add the glazes in, you probably just need to pick out those very edges again and just make sure that those highest highlights are as high as they can be, because that's what you need to get that non-metallic feel. It's the contrast between the dark and the light, and how quickly it happens and how they're next to each other. That's what makes your eye see it as metallic. I'm going to use some Vallejo Panzerace's Light Rust here, which is a sort of orangey brown colour, and I'm just going to add some of the grey to it, just to help it blend in with the blade. Now this is not for a rust effect, this is to simulate the reflection of the ground. So I painted the base of this model before I did the metallics, because I knew I wanted that to reflect in the blade to help it seem like a reflective surface. So by seeing the base, the colour it's going to be, as I add glazes over the surface, there'll be a point where in your brain you'll see the reflection on the metal, and you'll say, yeah, your brain will say, yes, that's the surface below reflecting off it. So it helps to have that painted first. If you're trying to paint something that's reflecting, paint that first so that you can see them next to each other, and then you'll see whether you need more or less of that colour in the reflection. And as that was a glaze, we're going to just brighten up some of those highlights again. So we're just going to take the white, just add in a few little strokes here and along the edges. With these last few little white highlights on the reflections, I think we've got the non-metallic feel we were going for. So the cutting surface is done. So I'm now going to use some Vallejo model colour German grey, and we're going to use this to sketch in a grid on the side of this blade, as I want to get a checkerboard pattern on there. So Vallejo model colour German grey is a very dark grey, just slightly higher in value than black, and so is a great colour to do these freehand sort of sketchings with. So it's just a series of vertical lines and then one horizontal line, and that will give us all the squares we need to fill in the checkerboard pattern. With the grid now done, we're just going to fill in each alternate square, and this will give us our checkerboard pattern. So we'll just use the German grey, and just using the very tip of your brush, just fill in those squares until you've got a checkerboard pattern. Just take your time, use the tip of the brush. You know, try and be as neat as you can, but if you do make a mistake, don't worry. You can see here I went over the edge of the cutting surface, but we know that was a white highlight, so we're just going to come back in and just put that in very carefully. And we'll go back to the black and use this to tidy up those squares a little bit. And this is why we painted it all black first, so we could touch up these little areas. If we'd left that as primed, then when we came to touch up little areas, they wouldn't look exactly the same. Each paint has its own finish, you know, how satin it is, how matte it is, and it's best to have a uniform finish, so when you do come back to touch up, you're touching it up with the exact same paint. So we're just going to mix some white into the German grey, and we'll just use this to add a few more layers on the checkerboard and the edges of that blade. So we want to lighten the squares a little bit, and so I'm lightening them towards the back of the hilt. I just think that it will look slightly more interesting, and they sort of fade as they get towards the business end of the chopper. So we're just going to mix in a little more white just to push it a little bit further, and again, just using the tip of the brush, we're just going to pick out that edge and lighten some of those squares. Now there is a hole in the end of this chopper, so assuming the light is above us, it's going to catch on the bottom, so we're just going to add a little highlight there. Now with our chopper done, it's time to move on to the shooter. So it's the same principle, so we're just going to use the Vallejo model Air Black and just give it a coat of that first. So if we're adding any more black later on, we know they're going to match up. So same as the chopper, we're just going to use Vallejo watercolor dark sea blue to start putting in our first highlight. So the first thing we have to consider is the shape of the object, and the shooter is essentially a cylinder. So we're going to add a nice big highlight of the dark sea blue down the side of the shooter towards the top. We'll use the dark sea blue to highlight the other parts of the gun as well, but they're all mainly flat surfaces now. So we'll just keep those highlights towards the top of those surfaces. For the next highlight, it's the same as the chopper. We're just going to take some of the scale 75 graphite and mix that in with the dark sea blue. And we'll just layer this on top of the previous highlights, just slightly smaller. But we'll try and keep it towards the top of that highlight. So it'll be strongest at the top and fading as it goes down and round to the underside of that cylinder. So just take my time, use the tip of the brush, apply a couple of layers. It's a smooth result we want, that's the priority. Now we'll take some of the scale 75 graphite and we'll just use this to push the value on those highlights. So again, just using the tip of the brush, we'll try and keep the highlights to the top of this, and so they gradually fade out as they go down. We'll also start picking out all the edges as well now. So we'll just work our way around the model, picking out all the edges, just using the very tip of the brush. All the other parts of this gun are so small, it's going to be mainly edge highlights. So you just take your time, just work round. So we're putting an edge highlight on the inside there, just to separate that shape from the cylinder shape, and we'll just pick out those details on the underside as well. So we'll now take some of the Vallejo model color ice yellow and we'll start putting that on as a highlight, and same again, we just want that at the very top so it's fading as it's going down. Just working our way around, picking out those edge highlights. And you can see now with that strong ice yellow highlight and these edge highlights, it's where it's starting to feel metallic now. So we're just going to try and smooth this out a little bit with some glazes of the mid-tone. And again, just like the chopper, it's a bit of a back and forth. So now we're going to take some of the white and just push those highlights even further. When you have two cylinders next to each other, you need to make sure that the highlights line up. This is especially important when you're using non-metallic metal and you've got really strong highlights. Just make sure they line up, and then your brain will see that as the same shape. Different pieces, but the same shape. Now I'm just going to go back to the graphite, and I'm going to add some little streaky highlights in underneath those main highlights. This is going to help to increase the area of highlight and just make this feel a bit shinier, a bit lighter in colour. Just increasing the size of those highlights will help it feel more like a shiny grey than a shiny black. So like we did on the Choppa, we want to get some of the reflection of the ground underneath. So we're going to take some of the Vallejo Panzer Ace's light rust, and we're just going to add some highlights on the underside here in the darkest area. And this will act as a secondary reflection, the light bouncing off the ground and hitting the underside of the gun. So this doesn't need to be strong. In fact, we're going to take some of the graphite here and just gently layer that over the top of it. Because it's thinned a little bit, it won't cover it completely, but it will just dull it down a bit and also add a bit of a sort of transition to it. And so we're now sort of getting that feeling of a horizon line and the ground underneath reflecting off the underside of the metal. So we're going to reinforce that horizon line now with some of the black. So again, like the highlight, we just need to make sure we've got perfectly straight line, and we're just going to use that to line up between the two different parts of the cylinder. And then we'll just use some little glazes to soften that. Now that we've had some glazes over the surface, we just want to push our highlights again. So I'm just taking some of the ice yellow, and I'm just adding a little bit of a highlight back onto the top there. And like I say, it's a bit of a back and forth between layers and glazes to get the right feel and how smooth you want the blends to be. So we're just going to take the graphite grey and just work on those highlights on the underside. And because this is a secondary light, this is bounce light, it won't ever be as strong as the highlight coming from above. So we'll just use the grey to put those highlights in. And we'll also start picking out some of those little details on the lower side. And there we go, he's all done. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found it of some use. If you did, let me know in the comments down below. I like what we've achieved here. I think the metallics look good, and I think the secondary reflection from the ground surface helps add a little bit of realism to the non-metallic metal. So, thanks for watching, guys. Please remember to like, ring the bell, all that fun stuff. And I'll see you soon. Bye.